In the words of the returning Julie James in this very movie, nostalgia is overrated. The irony being nobody told the writer of this movie to apply that very same logic to their script, if there even was a script. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
Before I get started, I'd like to kindly ask that you hit the like button, and please subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.
What are you waiting for, huh? What are you waiting for?
I Know What You Did Last Summer follows 5 friends who inadvertently cause a deadly car accident. They cover up their involvement and make a pact to keep it a secret rather than face the consequences. 1 year later, the past comes back to haunt them as they are stalked by a mysterious killer who knows their secret. So unfortunately, this continues the modern Hollywood trend of making legacy sequels to beloved or cult classic horror films of the past. Oh, and it also continues the lazy trend of calling the legacy sequel the same thing as the original film. Something that never really sat right with me. To me, if you're going to use the same name for a remake, that would make a lot of sense. But for a legacy sequel, it feels like a cheap way to try to bank off nostalgia that some people might have for the original film. I want everyone to think back to the early 2000s for a moment when another horror trend was sweeping over Hollywood, that being remakes. Many people were up in arms and flabbergasted at the idea of Hollywood remaking iconic horror films. A lot of people looked at that trend as being disrespectful to the original films. But if I'm being totally honest, I never really saw it that way. Those remakes from the early 2000s were basically taking the property and trying to do something a little bit different with them. To me, they upped the intensity to try to appeal to a more modern audience. And because they tried to be their own thing, they never really undermined the original films in any way, in my eyes.
That makes sense.
Now, not all of those early 2000s horror remakes worked, but I do tend to find some enjoyment in some of them. Then if you fast forward to 2018, legacy sequels became the new trend, with the idea that Hollywood was going to try to recapture the magic of the original films, usually with a heavy dose of nostalgia through legacy characters. Well, I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again here because it's relevant. Legacy sequels did a lot more damage to these brands than remakes ever did, because in most instances, they failed to recapture the magic as promised. And most of the movies sucked as well. Looking at things logically, you cannot replace John Carpenter with the guy who directed Your Highness and expect to get the same results.
It's true.
A lot of these slashers, specifically, that received legacy sequels, were very much a product of the time they were created in, whether that be the 70s, 80s, or now even the 90s. Trying to foolishly replicate that, to me, is a big reason why original horror has completely blew anything legacy horror out of the water in the past few years. Which brings me to I Know What You Did Last Summer 2025, which to its credit, feels more like a remake than a legacy sequel for most of its early runtime. Now, things are slightly altered, like the incident that sets the whole plot in motion. But for the most part, they are hitting a lot of the same beats as the original. And oddly enough, that was the part of the movie that I actually felt like worked the best. The new group of characters, while nowhere near as memorable as the original group, were likable enough, especially in the early stages of the film. I mean, they had chemistry, the scenes between them did feel somewhat authentic. They took a decent enough time early on to establish the interpersonal relationships between them. They even had moments early on where they let the kills resonate a little bit, which to me is always a better option than having them act as if nothing ever happened in the very next scene. Truthfully, if this was a straight up remake, like the early parts of the film felt like, I would have probably enjoyed it more.
Do the same thing as last time. Everyone's happy.
It's when they start to shoehorn in the legacy sequel stuff where this movie completely falls apart. In fact, I would say it's almost jarring how most of the legacy stuff is incorporated into the film. It's almost as if they had the whole movie planned out with this new crop of characters, and then someone at the studio said, we need characters from the original film to try to sell the movie. They needed that hook to get more people into the theaters, and who knows, it might actually work. But to me, it does absolutely nothing to improve the overall quality of this film. Listen, I'm never going to be upset about seeing Jennifer Love Hewitt on my screen again. She was hot back then. She's hot now. She will probably always be hot, regardless of what the trolls on social media say. And I do believe that Julie James is an underrated final girl that doesn't get the credit that she deserves.
Tits. Whew.
But sadly, I'm here to report that Jennifer Love Hewitt basically gets the Neve Campbell in Scream 5 treatment, where they basically use her face to sell this movie, but at the end of the day, she's nothing more than a glorified cameo. In fact, I would say that her and Freddie Prinze Jr.'s inclusion in this film overall does feel forced, which sounds weird to say when you're talking about two characters that basically the franchise was built on. But as always, this is something that people don't seem to understand. It's not enough to just have them in the movie. You have to use them in the right way. You have to use them in a way that feels organic and does not undermine their appearances in previous films. Both of these characters, for the most part, are nothing more than walking exposition dumps that are there to remind the audience of what happened in 1997. But ironically, we don't really need these reminders because the general plot of this movie actually kind of mirrors the original film.
Something very familiar about all this.
It came off as very lazy to me and frankly dumb to include these characters in this way. There's also another returning character from the original movie in this film that I will not spoil here. But let's just say that it's a scene that is very reminiscent of the Billy Loomis visions from Scream 5. Again, desperately trying to inspire a nostalgic reaction at the expense of the quality of your film. It's never going to work. As far as the more horror elements of the film, it was relatively tame, if I'm being honest. I can't say that any of the kills were all that memorable. There wasn't really much tension to speak of. I actually felt like the way that the killer set up the bodies after he killed them was more entertaining than the kills themselves. I always loved the design and the general look of the killer in these films, and that carries over to this film, so I was happy about that. I did find it a little ridiculous how the killer seemed to have ninja-like quickness and stealth capabilities while stalking people in such a bulky outfit. This movie is a whodunit, of course, in typical 90s horror movie fashion. In this film, they do throw a couple of red herrings at you, of course, to throw you off the scent of what's actually going on. But then the first big twist happens, and I have to be honest, outside of a reaction shot earlier in the film, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you take this twist into consideration. I like the general idea behind it. I actually like the motive, but I just didn't like the execution of it. It just felt kind of random and like they didn't earn the moment. But just when I thought it couldn't get any more random than that, the second twist happens, and this is where this film takes an even bigger left-hand turn into what the Phil. It's a bold decision for sure, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who are going to tell you that it was a good idea because it shows that the film was willing to take big chances.
No, 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 no. Hell no.
But it just did not work for me personally at all. It did not feel consistent with what we know from the original films. And this is what happens in the modern era when people try too hard with established franchises. This moment forces the audience to take a pretty big mental leap and willingly overlook certain things. And that's a big chance you take because there are always going to be people in that audience who are not willing to take that leap with you. And to be clear, it's not because those people are not open to new and fresh ideas. It's usually because whatever you are trying to do has so little logic behind it that it takes people right out of the film. And that's exactly the kind of twist that this movie is attempting to pull off.
No, don't like that.
And to cap it all off, they finish the film with a modern quip about men not being willing to go to therapy, which actually makes no sense if you take into consideration all of the things that happened in the third act. I Know What You Did Last Summer 2025 is yet another example of Hollywood going to the Legacy sequel well far too many times. I strongly believe that it is a trend that is well beyond its expiration date. Because no amount of nostalgia bait is going to distract me personally from the fact that I'm watching a poorly constructed, poorly made movie. The truth is that this movie would have had so much more potential if they kept things just a little bit simpler. Instead of giving us this convoluted mess that is clearly out of fresh ideas, so it got desperate as a way of trying to establish a buzz. The truth is that I felt next to nothing while watching I Know What You Did Last Summer 2025. It's not the worst thing that I've seen all year, but it definitely does pretty much nothing to justify its own existence. And that's why I'm going to give this movie the Careless Sam Gerard.
I don't care! Y'all be cool. Nah.